am Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome to 2023 in the Coffeeverse. We have finally eaten our way through all the Christmas cheese, and although we've been taking it slow during the 831 long days of January, we've been planning away in the background for an awesome year of shiny new spooky adventures. And we're kicking it off in style with a pretty epic interview in this first episode of the new year. So Fitz, spill the beans and tell us what's coming up on today's episode.
Coming up, we have a spate of paranormal activity in the 80s, which spurred the local council to take dramatic action on the Paranormal Radar.
So dramatic.
We have listener stories from Cody, Elliot and Megan, and we'll be speaking to one of the pioneers of paranormal podcasting, the one and only Jim Harold.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say welcome and a huge thank you to our latest patron, Penny Boyce.
And to Kate M for making a donation through coffee.
Thank you so much to all of our patrons, Repod and coffee supporters, old and new. You are the ones who keep the home fires burning here at Knock Once for Yes. Without your support, we simply couldn't do what we do. And we're so grateful that with your help, we're able to continue making the show and sharing all of our spooky adventures with all of you. It really does mean the world to us. So Fitz, what's pinged the Paranormal Radar today?
Right.
A very British one, this.
Yes. Our Paranormal Radar story today comes from the Derby Telegraph, and I was immediately captivated with the headline, "Ghostly Activities So Severe at Eagle Market That Council Issued Leaflet."
A leaflet.
I mean, that has to be peak Britishness right there. It's got to be a seriously sticky situation before you reach leafleting levels.
You're right.
I'd love to have been a fly on the wall at that council meeting, and it's not very often I say that.
Understandably.
The leaflet, which was titled Your Poltergeists and How to Deal with It.
I'm sorry. Can we just pause? I just need to hear that again. Your Poltergeist and How to Deal with It, because honestly, it's the most epic leaflet title I have ever heard. But do continue.
Indeed, it does very much have that keep calm and carry on public information film vibe to it. And whilst the article itself is recent, the story of a bizarre outbreak of paranormal encounters took place in the early 80s. But, like me, I suspect that you're wondering what activity prompted the local council to such drastic intervention. Well, it does seem like there was an awful lot of spooky goings-on at the Eagle Market, at least according to local ghost tour guide Richard Felix. Richard is perhaps most famous for being the historian on the UK paranormal TV show Most Haunted, but he's been running ghost tours in both Derby and around the country for many years. He also bought the old Derby jail and renovated it to become a museum, as well as making it available to book for paranormal investigations.
And that is somewhere we really need to get to.
We very much do. And on top of this, he's written several books and produced various DVDs on both history and the paranormal. One of said books is Ghosts of Derby, which was produced with Wayne Anthony, who I can find very little information about other than that he dubs himself a spiritual specialist. In the book, the pair have collected various ghost stories from around the town, including several that took place in the Eagle Market in Derby. These were said to include the account of staff in the basement of the shop they were working in having a chill pass over them at the same time that they experienced an uneasy feeling. Believing that another member of staff was approaching them from behind, they turned, and though no one was visible, they heard a woman's tortured scream of pain that gradually dissipated. But it wasn't only that shop that was affected. Staff and visitors were in fact having inexplicable encounters in shops all over Eagle Market. In one shop, the activity was more physical, and for some reason centred around clothing displays. Staff would frequently see clothes hangers move violently on their racks and wall pegs, and in the staff room they found an unused kettle plugged in and boiling, and later the same day, all 4 hobs of the electric cooker were found turned to full, the rings glowing red hot. In another location, boxes were thrown across the room, and the staff were certain that it wasn't possible that they'd simply fallen. Staff in a different shop reported that shoes that had previously been stored in a basket were found placed deliberately on the shop floor. They also found electrical items that had inexplicably turned themselves on, as well as taps spontaneously gushing with water even though they hadn't been touched. Many of the shops reported cold spots, and as time went on, the activity continued to escalate. Officials deemed it necessary to call in some professionals to investigate. They called in a team of security guards, which you might well expect, but perhaps more surprisingly, they also called in a ghost expert. We aren't told much about what the so-called ghost expert discovered, but the security guards who patrolled the site began to report their own experiences, including seeing a little girl dressed in old-fashioned clothes in a closed and locked shop. This encounter paralleled the experience of one of the shop managers, who saw a young lady with long hair on one of the upper levels of his shop. She didn't reply when he called out to her, and when he went to investigate, there was no one there. It seems that the unnamed ghost expert wasn't able to put a lid on the activity, and so a specialist in poltergeists and paranormal phenomena was called in, and shortly after that was when the infamous pamphlet was produced. The pamphlet provided to the shop workers covered such details as the history and nature of poltergeists, as well as a section on how to deal with them, and included some interesting statements, such as, poltergeists are quite common. Poltergeists are attached to and a part of the mind of an owner or group of owners. That once the pressures that have produced a poltergeist are understood, the activity will fade out. And one that will have horror movie fans screaming in disagreement that a ritual blessing will greatly help the affected premises.
Sounds like the start of untold hundreds of horror films.
Indeed. Sadly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, given the unnerving certainty with which the pamphlet doled out facts about something as yet unproven and unmeasurable, the advice provided in the pamphlet didn't seem to do much in the way of reducing the activity, and so it was decided that an exorcism was the only option. In December of 1983, the Bishop of Derby, along with other experts from Sheffield, was said to have held what is rather simply described as a meeting in one of the haunted shop basements, though I suspect that we're intended to infer that this meeting was in fact the performance of an exorcism, as the story continues that a further exorcism was carried out due to the ineffectiveness of the first. However many exorcisms there were, they all seem to have been pretty unsuccessful, as the activity continued to be reported for some time afterwards, only to slowly reduce in frequency over time and eventually, at least as far as we know, cease entirely. In true coffee fashion, I attempted to corroborate the reported stories in other sources, but despite the activity happening to multiple people across a considerable period of time, and having created such a local furore as to require the production of a pamphlet, I can find no other accounts or records of the spate of activity. Admittedly, it doesn't help that I was unable to locate the local newspaper's records for the years in question, with the British Newspaper Archive only having records prior to the time, and the local paper only having digital copies available for much more recent years. But I would have expected such a dramatic outbreak of paranormal activity would be more widely reported. What I'm really interested in, however, is, if the story is in fact true, getting hold of one of those leaflets. It's got to be a great bit of paranormal history, and we'd love to have one on display at Coffee HQ. So if you know if there are still any of them floating about, then do please let us know. I was also quite pleased to note that Derby City Council clearly have a sense of humour, something that appears to have been somewhat lost on the Derbyshire Telegraph. You see, during my research for this Paranormal Radar story, I came across another story on Derbyshire Live, the online version of the newspaper, with the rather bold, if somewhat verbose headline, Tenants with poltergeists advised to call Ghostbusters by Derby Council after paranormal query. It's a shame we missed this one for our Halloween special, as it was posted on the 28th of October of last year in response to a Freedom of Information request submitted to the council asking for the number of complaints submitted by tenants related to alleged paranormal activity at council homes. But, like many such stories dredged up in an attempt to get a ghost-adjacent headline on the page in time for Halloween season, it was a bit of a damp squib, as the council were quickly able to respond to the request with the reply that they didn't hold that information, and the majority of the remainder of the article jumps to local spooky star Richard Felix and his thoughts on the matter. I'm doubly amused at this point as the journalist doesn't say anything like, after this somewhat disappointing response from the council, we went to speak to local paranormal expert Richard Felix. It just continues as if Richard can somehow detect a paranormal news story with his mysterious spooky sense and appear on cue to answer questions. I've got this bizarre image in my head of Mr. Felix climbing the side of the building 60s Batman style and abseiling down into the room, having rushed over in the Felixmobile after the council lit up the Felix signal.
I want a Felix signal. I really hope that's how it happened.
Indeed. After we've finished with Richard's interpretation and maintaining the bizarre image in my head of him actually being present at the journalist meeting with the council, the article concludes with a somewhat tongue-in-cheek comment from a spokesperson from Derby City Council, and obviously the inspiration for the overdramatic headline, who said, "While we aren't aware of any links between paranormal activity and council homes, we do know that there are numerous tours around the city for those hoping to catch a glimpse of ghostly activity. And if there's something strange in your neighbourhood at this time of year, we'd encourage you to call Ghostbusters."
I would love to know how Derby City Council came up with a budget code for paying an exorcist.
Yes. Oh, yeah. We both worked in local government, and yeah, I've got to imagine that's going to have been a fun one.
I mean, even stationery can be difficult sometimes. If you want a Pritt stick, you have to jump through so many hoops to try and find what budget code to put it under. Where would you put an exorcist?
Yep.
How would you raise a purchase order for that?
Yeah, if you've never had a boring office job, you can't imagine the tedium of having to go through and say, does this count as this? Or if you're doing your taxes or something like that.
How does that come up on the tax return?
Oh.
Is that tax deductible? Is it? Sorry. Oh, this is brilliant. I love it.
Asking the important questions. Are exorcisms tax deductible?
Yeah, exactly. Well, inquiring minds need to know.
Indeed. So keep your eyes peeled for the Poltergeist pamphlet. But it's time now for our first listener story this episode, and this one is from Cody.
I had been staying at my friend's house instead of my family home for a summer between years at college. It was my male friend, his two brothers and their father. Their mother didn't live there. I shared my friend's bedroom, but we slept on opposite sides of the room. One night, after we'd turned the lights off and were trying to get to sleep, something grabbed my ankle. I screamed and asked what the hell my friend was doing. I turned the light on as I yelled, and he was turned over in his bed, facing the wall and under the covers. He was startled and asked what I meant. I said that my ankle was grabbed, and he vehemently denied doing it. He said something like, "I guess this stuff is going to start happening again." I asked what he meant, and he explained that any time a female started residing in the home, paranormal activity would ensue. His mother, his stepmother, and now me. It would stop when women stopped staying there. His friends had experienced things in the past, such as doors slamming on their own or lights turning off for no reason, with the light switch physically moving down as well. After that, I would hear whistling while I was alone during the day. I asked if anyone had come home for lunch or stayed home, and why they didn't say hi while I was sat in the living room, but I was told that nobody there knew how to whistle. This kept happening, and I started to also hear birds chirping inside. There were no birds in there, and there was no basement or attic either. Somehow I was able to dismiss all of this as something to not care about. Call it denial, maybe. But one night, my friend and I went to go and return some rental movies at Blockbuster and pick up some new ones. He forgot the ones we needed to return, so he ran back into the house after we'd got in the car to retrieve the DVDs. It was summertime, and they had all the windows and blinds open in the front. You could see almost clear into most of the common areas. The house was sort of like a duplex ranch style. Half a staircase went up to the left from the main entrance to the living room and kitchen, and another half staircase went down to the right towards the bedrooms. When my friend went in, I thought I saw him very clearly go down and to the right towards his room. Then I saw one of his brothers creep down from the living room, sneaking down the stairs after him. Then I saw his other brother doing exactly the same thing. To clarify, I didn't see precise features. I saw lanky forms of males sneaking down the stairs. No hair colour or anything, but it just looked like the two teenage boys, and did not look like their father, who was more stocky, not lanky. I thought, that's weird. Those boys never play like that. Those boys were all very serious and actually lacked a strong sense of humour. They just wouldn't be the type to sneak up on each other. They didn't find that stuff funny. But then I heard whistling. Again. So my friend came back out and I said, "What the heck were your brothers up to? Did they sneak up on you or something? That isn't like them." He had no idea what I was talking about. I explained and he said, "I have no clue what you saw, but I went upstairs to get those movies and I never went down to my room. And my dad and both brothers are still at the kitchen table eating dinner. Nobody has moved." I couldn't believe it. I was so bothered that I rushed into the house, and lo and behold, all three of them were still there at the dinner table. I explained my predicament, and their father just calmly looked at me and said, "Kiddo, we've told you there are ghosts here. We haven't moved from this table since you went outside. And for the last time, nobody in this house can whistle." He was laughing, but I was terrified. I moved out quickly after that and stayed with another friend.
And thank you to Cody for sharing that story. I must admit that took me on a little bit of an emotional roller coaster.
How so?
Well, the first bit that really struck me was Blockbuster and how Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore. And I was just hit by a wave of nostalgia and then, oh my God, I'm old.
It kind of ruined it for me a little bit though, because when I heard Blockbuster, in my head it was VHS.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they said DVDs, I was like, oh, I am old.
And then you had the creepy following down the stairs.
Oh, I know.
It gave me a really strong mental image in my head of just that happening, just people creeping down the stairs after somebody and then finding out that it wasn't them either. So it was three things creeping down the stairs.
Yeah, although, I mean, to be fair, it does sound creepy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was that sinister. I mean, the other thing you've got is whistling, which is that's quite an upbeat, sort of cheerful thing. And, you know, it could be that it was more playful.
Well, this is it. I was going to round it out with the father going, we've got ghosts here.
It's just how it is.
It's normal. And it obviously didn't bother any of them. And I know the ankle grabbing would have been terrifying.
Yeah.
And
again, still could have been more of a playful. Not that I'm saying, if it happened to me, I'd be absolutely horrified, but it is still more of a pranky kind of, it could be more of a prank, more of a playful thing, possibly.
Yeah, possibly, especially after the description of the boys, like not playing pranks or being jokey. It's like, have you got a sense of humour? Are you going to play? Are you going to have some fun?
Yeah, maybe the ghost just wanted somebody that had a sense of humour to play with, to prank, maybe. I don't know. It's a really interesting one, though. I don't think we've had anything quite like that before.
No, weird. But thank you again, Cody. Really interesting story. And now I feel old.
Yeah, me too. We are old. But let's not dwell, because we've got more stories to share, and this next one is from Elliot.
My first story takes place in Wimborne, Dorset, around December 2010. I was living with my sister, her partner, and my nephew, who was 2 at the time. We lived together while I looked for my own accommodation in the same town. We all lived in a 2-bedroom flat above a barber shop in the centre of town, and as we adjusted to living together in such a cramped space, we all started to notice a very heavy and dark presence that seemed to centre itself around the staircase of the flat, leading to the upstairs 2 bedrooms. My sister, her partner, and I had individually experienced a very intense feeling of dread and fear while using the staircase, but we hadn't spoken out about this to each other. I remember the feeling of utter terror as you ascended or descended the stairs, a feeling that someone or something was breathing down your neck, and their eyes were boring into the back of your head as you went. It felt as if, were this a real human, surely their nose would be touching the back of your head with a presence this apparent. One night, I don't remember who it was, but one of us sheepishly spoke out of this negative feeling surrounding the staircase, only for the other 2 of us to explode with intrigue and fascination at finding we weren't the only ones. My second story takes place in the same town of Wimborne, but in my own flat after having moved out from the flat in the previous story. I was living with my partner at the time, and we'd been living together for a year or so. One afternoon, we were having a heated argument in the hallway at the top of the stairs. The bottom of the stairs led only to the front door, nothing else. As the argument continued, we both suddenly stopped, as we'd both heard the bottom stair creak as if trodden on with a heavy foot. We both stood and stared down the staircase and at the front door, which was shut and locked. We stood in silence for what seemed like a few minutes, but must have only been seconds. Out of nowhere, footsteps ran up the stairs towards us. My partner held her hand to her mouth and backed away, and I pressed myself against the wall as the disembodied steps passed between us and into the living room, stopping suddenly. The flat then fell silent again. We were stunned. We checked our neighbours either side, but one side was away and the other was dropping her kids off at a friend's house. We never experienced anything else in that flat, right up until we moved out in 2018, a good 7 years total. Was this maybe an old echo, brought on by our expression of negative energy? It remains a mystery.
And thank you so much to Elliot for sharing those experiences with us. So a couple of things that piqued my interest. Well, the first thing I wanted to mention was, I think we've all been in that position where you know something's going on and you don't know if the other people in the house know. I mean, we've had this from living in a shared haunted house with lots of other people in it. And there really is no better feeling in the world than suddenly finding out all at the same time that you're all experiencing it. It's just such a relief.
But you say, we had a similar feeling, feeling of companionship after finding out other people had through it. But the experience was almost identical as well. It was our stairs, and it felt like someone, as you say, was right behind you, chasing you up and down the stairs.
I didn't even think of that, but yeah, you're completely right. It was all about the staircase. Yeah, that's weird.
We mastered the art of sprinting in the dark with our eyes closed at 3 o'clock in the morning if we needed to go to the loo, up and down the stairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even carrying stuff,
I'm amazed we didn't break anything like ourselves doing so. But yeah, really, really rang a bell with me, that one. And
Yeah.
both stories were centered around stairs. What is it with stairs?
Well, I mean, we've got
We
this
still
here
have it
in
here
this
with the
house.
stairs.
This is a different house. We still have weird stuff going on the stairs. I can only think it's because, you don't spend a lot of time on the stairs, do you? Nobody hangs out on the stairs particularly. It's one of those in-between places. And as we know, in-betweeny sort of liminal places that are neither in one place or another do tend to be hotspots. Anecdotal evidence would imply that they do seem to focus paranormal activity somehow. I just don't really understand how. But the other thing I wanted to mention was hearing the footsteps run up the stairs.
Oh,
It's just one of those things. I mean, we've come across it not personally. I don't think we've ever had this happen to
I've
us
heard
personally.
it run downstairs here.
But not up at us when you're on the stairs.
Yeah.
I think we've seen it happen. We've heard recordings of it on like ghost hunting shows and things like that, and other people's evidence from when they've experienced it, and it's just honestly one of the most terrifying things. I don't know. It's so frightening. Just hearing a recording of it is so frightening. It's one of those things that just has the hair on my arms standing straight up. Bonus points, though, for thinking to check whether your neighbours were in either side. That was really that was really good thinking.
Very impressive.
Very impressive.
Even if I'd have thought of that, I'm not sure I'd have been able to just go around. Did you just run up the stairs? In case they were thinking I was being stop being noisy.
Seriously good debunking skills going on there.
Good detective skills. Well done.
And it's really interesting that there then wasn't any more paranormal activity for years after this. So going.
Well, no, they said that was it. That was the only thing that ever happened until they moved out. So.
And the question is, could it potentially have been the negative energy of the argument? I think so. I know that even in this house, we don't have any particularly scary activity. A lot of it's just quite comforting, sometimes baffling, but it definitely has peaked at times during, international crises, for want of a better word. We've had a few turbulent few years, and we have found when there's a lot of stuff going on in the news, or when we've been waiting for a government announcement, when something internationally has been about to change, or something has been about to happen, we've had a lot more noisy evenings.
There's certainly been a couple of times when we've been like, wow, what is going on tonight? There's loads of activity, and we're check the news.
And then there's
because we don't often watch telly or anything like that. So it's better put the telly on, see what's on the news, because something big's going on.
Yeah, it almost, especially, during the last couple of years, it almost got to the point where we could tell it was worth checking the news because of the amount of noise, unexplained noise in the house. I've also found that, if we're feeling quite down or anxious about something, sometimes it picks up. And it's something that in our research we've come across so many times. You've got hauntings, you've got houses where other families who've lived in this house haven't experienced anything. And then you get a different family move in. There's a lot of disruption. There's a lot of negative energy going on. There's arguing, people having a really bad time. And all of a sudden they get this poltergeist activity and it's off the charts. So yeah, from personal experience and from research, I would say there does seem to be a correlation.
So thank you again, Elliot, for sharing those stories with us. We did enjoy hearing them, and thank you for bringing us back to our terrible nightmare house running downstairs at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Happy memories.
Indeed. Well, we've got one more listener story this episode, and this one is from Megan.
I was living in California when my sister-in-law at the time asked me to pick up a cat-sitting gig for her. Sure, I said, excited to play with some cats and get paid for it. But why don't you want to do it? Because the house is totally haunted, she replied. She went on to tell me that the woman's husband had passed away in the home, and she felt he was still hanging around. Doors that she knew she'd closed would be open when she came back. She heard voices, lights flickered, and the whole vibe of the home was just sad. She had pet sit only twice, but felt the money wasn't worth how uncomfortable the house made her feel. Knowing I had my own share of ghostly encounters, she thought I was better suited for the job. I met Carol the next day at her home so she could introduce me to the kitties and give me the lay of the land. The house had a unique layout. There was a driveway on the left-hand side of the property which led to a garage. This would be where I would enter and exit the house, and it was also where the paper was left every day by the delivery man. At the front of the house, however, there was a driveway loop that passed the front door. Carol let me know that there would never be a reason to enter the house from that side and to just use the garage. I wasn't given a key to the front door. Carol's home was quite large with beautiful vaulted ceilings, exposed beams, artwork and antique furniture. However, the whole home seemed almost untouched, with the exception of her office space where we met to discuss logistics. Carol's instructions were clear enough. Come 2 times a day, once in the morning to bring in the paper, and once in the evening to feed the cats. She was very clear that even though the cats only ate at night, I had to come in the morning after at least 7 a.m. to bring in the paper. She informed me that once she was on vacation, her home was robbed, and she believed the robbers knew her home was empty because of the papers piling up in the driveway. I could tell this story was painful for her. She also had the lights on a timer to make it look like someone was home in the evening. She was very, very firm that I had to come for the paper every morning. My first few days in the house were uneventful, but the house did have a depressed feeling to it. I roamed around the house on my first day and remembered thinking how sad it was for Carol to live in such a big home by herself. Her kids were grown and moved on, and her husband had passed away a few years earlier under some tragic and sudden circumstances. While the house was immaculate, it was also very obviously unused. I did have 1 or 2 situations of, I thought I closed that, but not enough to give me the heebie-jeebies. I did everything Carol asked of me. I was a barista at the time and had to get up quite early for my shift. There was one morning where I just could not get it together in time to make it to the paper. Oh well, I thought, what's one day? After my shift, I headed to the house. As I pulled up into the driveway, I noticed the paper wasn't there. I thought it was weird, but maybe it didn't come that day. No matter, time to feed the cats. I did my rounds for the night, but it did seem like the air in the house felt thicker. I felt anxious, as if I wasn't welcome. I pushed past the feeling, fed the cats, cleaned the litter boxes, and headed out on my merry way. I got in the car, and the paper thing was bothering me. Why wouldn't Carol mention the paper didn't come that day? Was it stolen? Did a neighbour grab it? A neighbour must have grabbed it. Something in my head told me to go and check the front door. Despite Carol's insistence, there would be no reason for me to go there. I pulled out of the main driveway and pulled into the driveway loop in front of the front door. Tucked up against the front door was the paper. I rationalised it immediately that one of Carol's neighbours moved the paper here to get it out of the driveway. Maybe they knew her story. I felt a pang of guilt for being irresponsible and a bit stressed that I wouldn't get this gig again, which paid pretty well for doing such little work. Rather than going all the way around and back in the house, I tossed the paper in my car and decided to bring it in next morning. I felt compelled to look up once more into the windows of the house. In one of the windows was a man, medium build, probably in his 60s, staring right at me. And he looked very angry. I felt like his eyes were looking straight through me. He didn't look quite right, almost a bit transparent, but definitely the full figure of a human. I knew I was not looking at a real person. I'd just been through that house. There was no way there was someone hiding in there. I peeled out of the driveway as fast as I could. My heart was pounding. I felt sick to my stomach. I was very confident that I had seen a ghost, and I think I knew who it was. The next morning, I went into the house, clutching the paper in my hands. The air again felt thick, like I didn't belong there. I wasn't welcome. In the entranceway to the kitchen, there was a photo wall. These photos confirmed what I already knew. The man I saw in the window the night before was Carol's husband. I said out loud in the house, "I'm sorry I didn't get to the paper in time yesterday. I was irresponsible. I'm only here for a few more days. It won't happen again, I promise." As soon as I was done with my grovelling, all of the lights flickered. My trips back to the house were very short after that, and I brought someone with me every time I could. The house still had an unwelcoming air. I think I'd really upset Carol's husband, and he wanted me to know that. When Carol returned, I told her she could mail me my cheque rather than going to pick it up. When she called me a few more times to cat sit, I told her I couldn't do it. Eventually, she stopped calling.
And thank you to Megan for sharing that story. That was a bit of a chiller.
Oh,
and
yes.
My favourite bit, and it always is in the stories like this, is when I went back in the next day and saw the pictures of the wall and it was them.
Yep.
It gets me every time.
I've actually had that happen. One of my family members has had that happen as well when they were staying in a family member's house of their husband's, and they had an experience. They saw an apparition, and the next morning they went downstairs and saw a wall of photos, you know, like one of those big frame, multi photo frames, and saw the person, the apparition that they'd seen. And obviously it was somebody who had passed away quite a long time ago.
Oh,
it's just so chilling.
Yeah, I don't blame you for not going back, but it's a shame. Like, it's a shame that he's so angry.
Yeah, and to be honest, I feel like you really did the right thing. You know, if I'd have been in that situation, that's exactly what I would have suggested. To, you know, the fact that you were respectful enough to just, you know, having identified who it was, realised that you'd done wrong and been irresponsible. You know, you owned up to it, you spoke out and said, you know, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to upset you, I won't do it again. I mean, that was perfect. There's not much more you can do. I wonder why he was so angry about the paper. I mean, well, I say why. I imagine it's because, you know, if his wife was so terribly upset because the papers potentially caused this robbery in the past to happen, then, you know, I suppose he had a right to be upset. You know, maybe not for so long.
No, I'm not for just once.
No,
because, you know, they're not going to know if there's one paper. You know, maybe you just forgot to go and answer the door or something.
Yeah, but
when there's a pile of papers, yeah, it's obvious. But
I mean, an apparition, a ghost like that, I mean, it sounds like such an intelligent haunting, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Really intelligent haunting. But
when it was looking right at her, it's definitely not a sort of...
But we don't know what kind of sense of time that ghost is experiencing. Well, we don't know what a ghost is, really.
No.
You know, we're very much in theoretical territory here, but who's to say that the passage of time is passing the same for them? I mean, we don't know. You know, for Megan, it could have been days. For the ghost who was angry, maybe it didn't feel like day. Maybe it wasn't days to them. Maybe it was an hour. We just don't know, do we?
So thank you again, Megan, for that awesome story. And I note that you've also told us that you've got a few more stories to share.
Yes, we did. We duly noted it. Please, if you feel like sharing them, we'd love to hear them.
And that is the end of the listener stories for today's episode. Thank you so much to everyone who shared their story with us today. We are so grateful to be entrusted with reading them. Your stories are the heart and soul of the show, so if you have a story that you would like to share, then please do get in touch over on our website at knockOnceForYes.com. But it's certainly not the end of the show. In fact, we're just getting warmed up, because up next, we have an absolute corker of an interview with none other than Jim Harold.
I'm pretty sure that most of you will know the name, and many of you probably, like us, discovered paranormal podcasts in the first place through one of his shows, such as Jim Harold's Campfire or the Paranormal Podcast, which really was one of the first paranormal podcasts out there. Sometimes it's strange to think that we've been making this show now for over 6 years. I don't think that when we started way back in 2014, we ever thought we'd be in a position to still be making episodes 6 years on. And I'm sure that we never thought we'd get to interview Jim Harold. So you may just detect the occasional quiver of fangirling in our voices. But man alive, did he have some interesting stuff to share. So without further ado, we very much hope you enjoy this conversation as much as we did. Jim Harold, welcome to Not Once for Yes. I do think that a lot, if not most of our listeners, will have heard of you because you are one of the founders of the paranormal podcast movement. In fact, I remember my brother recommending your show to me. I think it was way back in 2006. But for any new listeners, can I ask you, how long have you been doing paranormal podcasting now?
2005. I started in the summer of 2005, and it was so early that my first show, and the show still continues, is the Paranormal Podcast. I was able to get that name, so that kind of tells you how early on it was. And it almost was the Paranormal Podcast. There weren't very many back then. I think that show is the longest running continuous paranormal podcast on the internet. I think so. I don't have 100% proof of that, but I think that is true. And then, of course, we have Jim Harold's Campfire, but it's been a great journey. I've loved it. It turned from kind of a hobby to a career, so it's been great.
And you're certainly the first paranormal podcast that we actually came across.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems to be a family tradition now because your daughter is doing her own paranormal podcast as well. But I'm intrigued to know what the rest of your family and friends think about both paranormal in general and that you've made a living talking about the paranormal. You've turned it into a career.
Well, I think that attitude has evolved over the years. My wife, Dar, has always been supportive, and by extension, my kids have been supportive, even though probably my kids are more skeptical than my wife or myself. In terms of friends, I could remember when I, told people that, I do this podcast about the paranormal. And the first question was, what's a podcast? And the second thing was kind of like, oh, that's nice. And then when I told people back in 2011, I'm going to quit my full-time job and try to podcast full-time, I could kind of hear the gears turning in their heads, and they're thinking, oh, bless your little heart, Jim.
Yeah,
we've seen that look before.
Yeah, we've experienced that ourselves.
Good luck with that. Good luck with that. I'm sure it'll be a huge success, yes. But astonishingly, it has been a pretty good success. I'm a successful mid-tier podcaster from my point of view. We're not going to, give Joe Rogan a run for his money or anything in terms of popularity. But I've been very blessed to make kind of a middle-class living doing this. And something that I'm still just as fascinated about today as I was back in 2005 when I decided to take up this topic for my first podcast.
So for both Fitz and myself, I think one of the things, or some of the things that encouraged us to become interested in the paranormal in the first place, and thus end up where we are today doing a podcast, and also influenced the way we viewed the paranormal as we sort of grew up into adults, was that our families didn't treat ghosts as anything really weird or scary. That was quite a common outlook in Britain in our area at the time. Every old pub and stately home and castle had a ghost story. They were quite proud of them. We didn't have a lot on the paranormal on TV, but we did have plenty of books. There was sort of the touristy pamphlets on local hauntings and almanacs and gazetteers by the pipe-smoking, tweed-jacketed academics, and even sort of more modern fare that were aimed more at children like us. We had our much-beloved Usborne Book of Ghosts. So it was quite an easy thing for us to pursue an interest in. But I'm curious, what was the landscape like for you growing up in the US? Because obviously it's something we just have no reference for.
Well, I believe that in the U.S., maybe people were a bit more skeptical generally. I think that's certainly changed over the last 15, 20 years with the TV shows and so forth. And when I'm talking about the ghost hunting shows and those kind of things, and they have their positives and they have their negatives. But I think more people have come out and said, yes, I've experienced something. So I think it's becoming more acceptable than it used to be. We didn't have the virtue of that history that you all have over in the UK. I was there pre-pandemic. I've only unfortunately been able to go one time over to your beautiful country, but just fantastic history, which lends itself, as you say, to that kind of acceptance of the idea of ghosts. Now, my family, on the other hand, it wasn't like they were saying, well, we see a ghost every third Thursday of the month, or we have dinner with the aliens on the weekly or anything like that. But they had a couple of very powerful experiences that kind of lived in family lore that they experienced directly, my parents. And they were working class people. My mom's passed. My dad is still with us, a steel worker and a stay-at-home mom, very kind of working class folks. So not really given to, sleeping with a pyramid under their bed or anything like that. So I always took it seriously and always had the viewpoint that life is much more mysterious than we give it credit for in our daily lives. Plus, a nice dose of Leonard Nimoy and In Search Of kind of help light the fire as well.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
yes.
We never had that here, so that's one thing we missed out of. I'm going to have to see if I can dig out
it's great.
It's
great. I was an elementary school viewer and would never miss it every Sunday night, and I would be terrified, but I loved it. It was great, and they always had a wide range of mysteries, and I always carried that with me, that fascination, and that's it's part of the inspiration for starting this in 2005.
That's really interesting because we've only seen clips of so many people talk about that Leonard Nimoy show. I'd love to see it. Well, we'll have to dig it out at some point.
We had to make do with, Ghosts of Leicester or Ghosts of Cornwall when we went on holiday, and it's just a little pamphlet that people had put together with stories they'd collected from locals over the years they'd interviewed them.
Of course, which has its own charm. So you've actually visited England then. Did you get to see any of the history or haunted places while you were over here?
I went to the Tower of London. I went to quite a few pubs. We split our time between the Sheffield area and London. My wife's uncle lives in Sheffield, and him and his wife. And we spent some time with them in the Sheffield area. And then we also spent a few days in London. And this was, again, 2019, right before the pandemic. So we got in just under the wire.
Perfect timing.
And it was just tremendous. And I remember, I think it was at the Tower of London, they had a door that dated from the year 1000. Mm-hmm. And they said it was the oldest wooden door in England. And I'm just thinking about 1000. And then I remember drinking in a pub, not to excess, but having a drink or two in a pub. And it was literally, I think, from the 14 or 1500s. And I was amazed that somebody sat at a table, maybe not that table, but a table, several hundred years ago and basically did the same thing I was doing. It blew me away. We don't have anything to compare with that kind of history here in America.
No, we've got a lot of that going about, and every pub's got a ghost story.
Yeah, every single pub.
Guarantee that there'll be one there at some point.
Well, it makes sense because they say that the places that are most haunted are places that have a lot of emotion and a lot of energy. And I'm sure there's a lot of boisterous energy in all the pubs across England and all the fights and, romances and frustrations and all the different things. So it would seem like it'd be a perfect recipe for a haunting.
Absolutely. It's the one place where you just see the whole variety of human dramas play out year after year after, century after century. So, yeah, I think sometimes we do take it for granted a bit in England because I mean, we've got, even in our small little town, we've got a monument from about the 14th century, I think. And I think when you grow up with it, I don't think we always appreciate just the depth of history that we've got. So, yeah, but you really went in big to go straight to the Tower of London. I mean, that's one of the most amazing historical places you could have visited. So we need to visit there again. It's been years since I've been.
There's one thing I find fascinating about these old buildings is, you say it goes back to sort of 1400, 1100, but you can almost guarantee that the stone they use from that has been reused from something else. There's a lot of times we've come to buildings, it might be a 13th century church, and they've reused Roman architecture to rebuild it into a church. So not only is that sort of from the 1300s, the stone's been shaped by someone hundreds of years prior to that as well. It's crazy.
And then if you go to some place like Westminster Abbey, which we always did, we jammed a lot in, also saw Stonehenge. I mean, we really packed it in. But we went to Westminster Abbey, and it's like, you see it on TV and it's beautiful and everything, but it's like, this is a graveyard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't really, at least I never really thought about that very much. And it was like, oh my, really added to the sense of history there. Just amazing.
Well, so to bring it back to the US for a bit then, we recently spoke to a folklorist, and we were talking about sort of the crossover and the links between folklore and the paranormal. And it's just made me really, really curious now about the sort of local lore and folk tales and myths and legends from people's hometowns. We don't really have that many in our hometown. So how about the area that you're from? Do you have like urban legends or a particular folklore or myth or story from where you hail from?
Well, I'm from Ohio, and I'm from the Cleveland, Ohio area. And one place that we have that is, it's called Franklin Castle. Now, you would kind of laugh at the word castle because I think it was built in the 1800s, a veritable pup compared to UK architecture. But there's all kinds of stories of bad things befalling the owners, and it goes from owner to owner, and it's almost like kind of like the Hope Diamond, in that there's stories of misfortune and so forth. And I think most recently, and I don't have the exact stats on this, is that it actually somebody was working to rehab it and so forth, and there was this huge fire, and I think it's currently in limbo. So that's one that comes to mind in the Cleveland, Ohio area, is Franklin Castle. In terms of other ones, I mean, we tend to have more cryptid stories, I think, than ghost stories. Even though Cleveland's a major metropolitan city. But in Ohio in general, there's stories of Bigfoot sightings.
Oh, wow.
And all sorts of things. And even we have a large lake that basically Cleveland, the city, is on the coast of. One of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie. And there's been, talking about the broader sense of kind of the paranormal, a lot of reports of UFOs over Lake Erie. Because on my shows, we cover it kind of all, not just ghosts, but we cover UFOs and cryptids and things.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting because a lot of people who are involved in the paranormal and people that you will see on the TV shows, I'm always amazed about how many are from Ohio. So maybe it's just something about Ohio.
Something in the water, perhaps.
Could be.
It's interesting you should bring up the sort of UFOs and the cryptids and things, because we were speaking to, like Liv was saying, a folklorist recently, and we've noticed that a lot of these things get separated out. UFOs are one thing, cryptids are another thing, ghosts are another thing. But 100 years or so ago, they were all basically folklore.
They were all talked about in the same arena before, weren't they? Even when we were growing up, I feel like they were talked about in the same books. It was a book would be a collection of myths and monsters and folklore and UFO stories. That would have everything. And I just feel like over recent years, they've been separated out into sort of different umbrellas.
Oh, I agree 110%. For example, when I named the Paranormal Podcast, I wasn't thinking, a ghost show. But now I tell somebody I do a show. I'm probably best known for Jim Harold's Campfire, which is true stories from experiencers. But my number 2 show is the Paranormal Podcast. And if I lead with that and tell somebody that, they're like, oh, you do a ghost story show. I mean, or you do a ghost show. And it's like, yeah, and UFOs and cryptids and stuff that doesn't quite fall into a category, and life after death and near-death experiences. It is in that old spirit of a show like In Search Of, where, to me, the paranormal, by definition, is that which does not lend itself necessarily to a convenient kind of mainstream scientific explanation, things that seem like they might potentially be outside of that. And so me, it's I believe in the big tent philosophy, and I think you hit it on the head. I think now it's like, I think especially since the ghost shows came in on TV, it's like they use the word paranormal so much that it's become, paranormal equals ghosts, ghost hunting, and vice versa. And it's kind of annoying to me, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you point that out. And it's not just me who thinks that, because to me, the paranormal is all of it.
Exactly.
And do you think it's all sort of part of the same phenomena, or just that, we should allow crossover? Because there's definite crossover in things. If you think 100, 200 years ago, the lights in the sky would have been pixies or instead of UFOs. So there's definitely some sort of crossover there. And
I think in sort of the stories that we've heard, there does seem to be some overlap. Like it's like a Venn diagram. There's places where stories overlap.
Oh my! Well,
have you found that?
Well, I was just going to say Venn diagram.
Yeah,
that's exactly what I was going to say, because I don't think it's always the case, but I think it's sometimes the case. For example, there's a researcher who's done work in Pennsylvania, Stan Gordon, who has looked at the coincidence of UFO sightings with Bigfoot sightings. And I got to admit that if you look at a lot of these questions, probably something like Bigfoot is one that I'm more skeptical about than most. I always say that if you look at kind of, if someone wanted to know my thought process and, you going from one scale of true believer to absolute skeptic, I'm probably, if you're looking at a fuel gauge or a petrol gauge, that I would be 3/4 full towards belief. But there's still, a little bit of skepticism in there, trying to keep a little healthy skepticism to some extent. But getting back to your question, I think I lost your question there. But I do think it's the Venn diagram situation. I think that it's not always an overlap, but I think there is some overlap. And I often wonder, is there a trickster element in all of this? Is there something messing with us a little bit and maybe presenting itself in different ways? I don't know the answer.
Oh, could be. Yeah, I would tend to agree. And that's an interesting thought.
There certainly does seem to be some element of that in some of the ghost stories we've heard. So if you take it a step further removed, that there's something larger that's just messing with people, I wouldn't say that I don't believe that.
You wouldn't disagree.
And it's tough when you do what we do, because often I find myself at odds with myself. I believe, for example, that there's a very good chance that there are extraterrestrials, and there's a decent chance that they've visited. But I also think there's a decent chance that it's something playing a trick on us. So same with ghosts. I tend to believe that our loved ones come back and visit us and get messages to us. But then I also believe that the nature of reality might be far different than what we think. And there may be the multiverse and the many worlds theory and all those things. So I often find myself in my quiet hours arguing with myself.
I can completely understand that.
Exactly what you're talking about. But I just settle it by going, I don't know, but it's fascinating.
Yep. And that's the thing. You hit it, Fitz. I mean, when I first started this in 2005, I said, this is going to be great. I'm going to get to talk to some of the greatest minds in the paranormal, and I'm going to have this stuff figured out in 6 months. Well, I've got news for you. 17 years in, I have more questions than I had when I started. I'm more confused than when I first started, but I will say this, I'm more convinced in the reality of paranormal phenomena, and I'm more convinced that the nature of reality is far more complex and far stranger than we understand. And that's probably part of the explanation for all of this.
Well, you very cleverly sort of perfectly segue into what was going to be the next thing we asked you about, because having been listeners of your show for very many years, actually, we've heard you talk before about how you thought you were going to get answers to questions by doing this show, but you've actually ended up with more questions, as have we, actually. So I wondered if you've had any particular stories that have really just flipped everything on its head, because I think we've definitely had those things where you start to think you might be getting a handle on kind of what's going on, and then somebody gives you a cracker, an absolute corker of a story that just blows it all out of the water, and you think, wow, actually, I don't know anything at all. That's completely changed the landscape.
Usually I tell a story called Roadhouse Saloon, but I'm not going to tell that because I tell it so often. But there's another story that was more recent, not as elaborate, but this was from a healthcare worker actually in my neck of the woods in the Cleveland area, which was kind of fortuitous, kind of neat that she called in. And she was, I believe she was worked as a respiratory therapist or something like that. And she also helped in transporting patients. So she was working with this one patient and had to somehow help them transport them to another department for an X-ray or something. I can't remember exactly. And she was with another person, another staff member, and they carted this gentleman into this large elevator, the large hospital elevators that can fit a hospital bed. Mm-hmm. She looks up and she sees across the way there's another passenger elevator. She looks up, she sees a group of people getting into the elevator, healthcare workers, looks like. And there's a woman who looks a lot like her. And the woman turns around and looks directly at her, and it's her. Wait,
what?
It's not over yet. So later that day, it's been a long day. She's been racking her mind. It's whatever it is, 4 or 5 o'clock at night, whatever quitting time is. She's getting ready to go home. She's standing at the passenger elevator with her colleagues getting ready to go in. She walks into the elevator. She turns around, she looks up, she sees somebody transporting a patient in the freight elevator. And there's a woman that looks a lot like her.
Oh, my word.
And it is her. She saw herself from earlier that morning.
What?
Now, I think there's 2 possibilities here. And I would say this to the caller, and I don't believe the first possibility, by the way. Either she's lying, which I don't know what good that would do her. Mm-hmm. Or she experienced something that I would truly call paranormal, and I would say that would hint towards what I was talking about earlier, that idea that reality is far stranger, and maybe there was some kind of glitch in the matrix. Who knows? I mean, I have to be honest, I love ghost stories, but my favorite are those kind of stories, the head scratchers.
Yeah, it's got a lot of time slip about it as well. Other than the fact with time slips, it tends to be a longer period, and you don't see yourself, you see other people. But that is almost like a tiny mini, like a 1-day time slip.
That's so fascinating. I mean, we've had some experiences that I would say, fall into the time slip category. We once both heard an air raid siren, and we thought it was a flood siren, but there was no flood warning siren that went off. We were the only people that heard, but both of us heard it. Mm-hmm. There was also another occasion where I saw an apparition who just waltzed into our bedroom. But the strange thing about it was that we locked eyes and he looked so confused that I was in his room. That was the expression. It wasn't me going, oh my goodness, there's a ghost in my room. He was looking at me going, what on earth is this strange woman doing in my room? What's happened?
You were the ghost.
I was the ghost. And I think your explanation of just reality is just far stranger than we give it credit for a lot of the time is so spot on.
Yeah, there's many a time we just, we'll hear a story from somebody and we'll just, there's no words. You're just like, huh? How do I make sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, and I'll say this to callers, when it's an extraordinary case like there, it's like, I have 2 explanations. One, you're making this up, which I don't believe you are.
No.
And 2, you experience something supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're going to move on just to a slightly different angle. And obviously, you hear a lot of stories, and it's probably going to be pretty hard to pick a favourite. But do you have like a favourite type of story? Because we love a good scary story, but there's something about the mundane stories. We had a chap on called Dorian Deathley, who's a haunted tour guide from York, which is a wonderful place to visit if you ever get the chance. And he told us about a haunting where the ghost of Guy Fawkes has been encountered, and you might think that the ghost of Guy Fawkes would do something pretty scary, or at least ominous or threatening, but apparently he just loves to show people his collection of sticks, because his hobby when he was alive was collecting sticks. And it's just so wholesome and normal and human. And is there anything that sort of jumps out to you from the stories you've heard? A really
lovely mundane ghost story. If we because they're our favourites. Your favourites are the head scratchers, and our favourites are the mundane, just such human, normal stories.
Well, it's not a ghost story, but I just thought of one that, and I don't know when this is going to air, but this is actually a Christmas story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a ghost story per se, but it's a story of something that's inexplicable. Our one caller, and it may be going too far afield, but it's just one of those things that makes you go, oh my goodness, what was that all about?
Yeah.
So anyway, this one little girl, for Christmas, she wanted Santa Claus to fix her bear, brown bear, she called him.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little bear, and when you squeezed his ear, he would play music or talk. And it was broken. And she had asked her parents, hey, you know what? I don't want anything else for Christmas. I want Santa Claus to fix Brown Bear.
Oh, bless her.
And they said, well, honey, Santa Claus is pretty busy. You know, her Father Christmas. And perhaps it'd be easier for him. He's so busy. He could just get you a new toy, maybe a new Brown Bear. She said, no, I want Brown Bear fixed.
Oh.
So anyway, Christmas Eve, she puts Brown Bear on their fireplace hearth. So Santa won't be able to miss it. She writes a little note and puts it down. And that morning, her and her sister get up to race to see all the toys laid out and everything. Her sister goes right to the toys, opening the toys and so forth. Not our caller. She's 6 years old. She goes right to the hearth. Brown Bear's not there, but he's over on the couch. She presses his ear, and he works.
Oh.
But here's the thing. Years later, and by the way, her parents looked astonished. Years later, she asked her parents, did you give Santa some help? Did you guys fix it? Because her dad was very handy with tools.
Mm-hmm.
Her mom was very crafty and very good with sewing and those types of things. And they said, absolutely not. And even a day or two before she called into the show, she called her dad up and said, okay, Dad, you could tell me now, did you guys fix Brown Bear? And he said, absolutely not.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, I know that's not that, but that's just kind of a warming. And I mean, in the big scheme of things, it's a little girl's teddy bear. But,
that's perfect. I love those kind of stories. They just make my day. Those kind of stories just light me up.
They're the things that stay with you, though.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you hear scary stories and, give it 6 weeks and I'll probably struggle to remember the details, but a story like that will stick with you.
Yep, you will remember that forever, just like Guy Fawkes and his sticks collection.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that, I mean, there are scary ghost stories, but I get a lot of shadow people stories. A lot of people have shadow people stories, and those are quite frightening. Those figures that look like they're cut out of the universe, those kind of things, very, very kind of scary.
We lived with some for a while.
Yeah. But I got to tell you, as you said, my favorite stories are ones like that or the other ones. I have another one that comes to mind that really questions the nature of reality. There was this young woman who worked up in our New England region, very cold area in the state of Vermont. And this was in the early 80s before cell phones. And she had graduated college, but she decided she wanted to take some more evening classes. And it was about an hour from her house, so she would just commute back and forth. Well, one night, it's probably almost 8 o'clock at night, dark, cold, snowy, and she's driving back home, and she's maybe 40 minutes from home, and her car dies. And she's on a highway. And, again, keep in mind, no cell phones, no way to communicate with anybody. So she said, I'm not just going to sit here and freeze. I'm going to get out. And she saw on the parallel road down below her, over an embankment, that there was some lights obscured by trees. And she's like, I bet there's a house down there. I can go and use a phone and get help. So she wasn't really dressed for it, but she kind of struggled through some brush cover and those kind of things and walked down this hill. And she saw a petrol station, a gas station with a garage, and said, oh, what luck. This is perfect. So she walks in. There's a young man at the register, and she tells him the situation, I need some help. And he points at the clock, and it's 5 minutes of 8. And he said, we're about to close. But he said, the owner lives next door, and I'll see if he can help you. Then it almost seemed like he appeared out of nowhere. And he was there, the owner, fatherly guy, probably in his 50s, and said, yeah, I'd be glad to help you. Let me come on up. And he went up and took his tow truck up and took a look. And he said, yeah, I can't fix this tonight, but is there some place you can tow it? Is there a garage we can tow it to? And she said, sure, but it's like 30 minutes away. And he said, no problem. Hooks up the car, takes it to this garage, tells her what to write on the note. She puts the note in. He said, okay, now you've got to get home. And she said, well, that's another 20 minutes away. And he says, no problem. I'll take you home. And he takes her home. And he says, tell your folks nothing to worry about. Everything's going to be just fine. He was very intentional on that. And he didn't mention it, but she mentions it. Oh, I've got to pay you, but I only have a couple dollars in my, she asked how much it was going to be. He said $20. She said, I've only got a couple bucks on me, but I could write you a check. And he said, that'll be just fine. So she goes in, and she just kept thinking to herself, what a nice person. Really restores your faith in humanity. And she goes in and tells her folks. A day or two later, she's going shopping back to the big town. And she's with her sister and her mom. And she said, let's take a little detour. I want to drive you past this little gas station because the gentleman was so nice. I want to show you where it was at. She drives past it. And what she saw shocked her a little bit. The gas station looked like it had been closed for 10 or 15 years, totally boarded up and abandoned. And she said, as far as she can recall, that check was never cashed.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, that is, yes, it's a head scratcher, but it's also just one of those that it flips everything on its head, doesn't it? Because he drove her home. Like, how is that possible?
Yeah.
That is a real head scratcher. Wow. That's just amazing.
No, I love those stories. Those are my favorites. And I hope someday we get the answers. I tend to believe in life after death and hope somebody sits us down and says, or either it's just like immediately imparted onto us when we leave this, shuffle off this mortal coil that, and then you kind of go, oh, now I see. Now I see what it was all about. I hope we all have that moment.
Oh, I hope so. So one of the things we do on this show is we visit haunted locations around the UK. We do it as tourists. And one of the reasons for that is because we love investigating as much as the next person. But we do think there's really a lot to be gained from just experiencing haunted places in daylight. And you don't necessarily have to be running around in the dark to have a ghost experience or to just appreciate the buildings. So I wondered, if you could go to any haunted location anywhere in the world, what would make the top of your list?
Oh, my. Oh, that's such a tough,
yes,
such a tough question. There's actually one that I'd like to go to that's not too far from here. And the ironic thing is I never knew it was haunted. In the American state of West Virginia, there's a place that, and this is what it was called, it's an unfortunate name, but the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum.
Oh, we've heard of that, yeah.
The odd thing is I used to pass that every year as a child. We would go visit my family on my mom's side who lived about 30 miles from it.
Oh.
And there was always, at that time, people weren't as sensitive as they are now. They weren't as kind, maybe. And there would be always a joke of like, okay, who are we dropping off at the hospital this year? That kind of thing. But, and it was still active. It was still being used as the state hospital, they called it.
Oh, right.
I didn't know it was still in use that recently.
Yeah, this would have been the 80s, 70s and 80s. So, to find out that it's like this prime haunted location, it's like, what am I doing? I need to go down there and check that out. So that would be one place. And then we have another place here in Ohio called the Mansfield Reformatory. And I believe that it was the prison that was used or was the basis of the movie Shawshank Redemption. So I should be shamed because they're two really close locations within a couple 100 miles that I could and should go to. So this summer, I've got to at least pick one and go to one of them.
Yeah, I think you should. Yeah, with them being on your doorstep. I mean, some of those locations are on our bucket list.
Yeah.
and what honestly, what I would say is I like what you said because I'm not much into paranormal investigation. For me, one thing is it's interesting because I'm sure you have it with your football matches and so forth on television. A lot of the analysts and things are former players or coaches and that type of thing. We have the same thing here with our American football and baseball and things. But I also like to hear from the broadcasters who are just broadcasters and get their perspective, like an outside perspective. And I kind of feel that way. I don't want to get too much into paranormal investigation because I like having a little bit of arm's length. But what does appeal to me is this whole idea of tourism. I think that's really great.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that as well, I mean, I'm not sure how it is in America, but certainly over here, a lot of the heritage buildings and things like battlefield sites, stuff like that, their upkeep is funded on tourism. And of course, we want these heritage places, haunted locations, these beautiful buildings and historic battlefields, places like that. We want them to be preserved. So if you can get out there and you can visit as a tourist, you're helping maintain that location for years and years to come and preserving it for everybody else to enjoy.
Yes, I agree. And that's one thing that I admire about your country. Was it National Heritage it's called or something like that?
We've got National Trust and English Heritage. There's two that do a sort of similar thing.
And I admire that. I wish we had more of that in the States. Now, we do have the National Park System, which is very good, but there's less for historic sites. It's almost kind of like a hodgepodge of different local organizations and more. I wish we had something like that. And I think you all are to be commended for realizing the importance of history and preserving those sites and keeping them kind of living in a way. I think it's great.
Exactly. You're becoming part of the story in a way.
One of the problems we've got here is there's so many of things that they don't get protected until they're too late. You might have 3,000 13th century farmhouses one year and then half of them get developed and it's all of a sudden you're like, oh, there's only 10 of these left. We really ought to protect them.
Yeah, sometimes we do fall into the trap of actually some of our historic buildings are too common. They commonly occur, so they're not seen as needing to be protected because there's just a lot of them to go around. So we have some different issues. But yeah, I highly recommend just going to haunted locations as a tourist. This is one of the things we always say. We've had, I think, more paranormal experiences even in broad daylight, visiting some of these places than we have done doing actual paranormal investigations.
Yeah, I kind of wonder sometimes if you go looking for it, maybe it'll hide more kind of thing. That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me.
And a funny story, actually, on a paranormal investigation we did do, we kind of experienced that firsthand. We were visiting the house that Oliver Cromwell used to live in. And it was a group investigation. So there were a big group of people in the middle of the room and they were doing a spirit board or something like that. absolutely everybody in the group, apart from us, was looking at what was going on this spirit board. Now, we hadn't really seen anything much happen at that time in that room. But we started looking behind us into the other room, into the shadows, sort of out of the doorway. And then we saw white figures moving around in the background. And it literally was as if whatever was there was just doing their best to keep out of the way of this massive group of people. Yeah, and they were hiding in the other room. Just
occasionally peeking in at us to see what everyone else was doing.
To see if we'd gone.
It was really strange.
Yeah, it's what an interesting way that we're all so fortunate to be in this area and doing these podcasts and being able to visit these places if we choose. I just think it's such a remarkable opportunity and really a remarkable time in history that we have the blessing of being able to do that. And I think sometimes, I'm a little bit more middle-aged than, the very young people coming up. And I'm like, I feel like saying, this is the most amazing thing ever. We get to do this from our homes and do these podcasts and talk about these cool things. What a neat time in history, speaking of history.
Well, talking about doing cool things from home, you've spoken to lots of very interesting people in the paranormal vein. I'm interested to know if there was somebody that you haven't spoken to yet, or somebody that has passed.
For somebody from history.
Somebody from history that you wish you could interview. Who would that be?
Oh, boy. Oh, you ask tough ones. Well, in terms of the paranormal, people like Hans Holzer would have been fantastic. Mm-hmm. I got to interview Brad Steiger multiple times, a great author, on the paranormal. Another one of my favorite guests who has passed was the great Rosemary Ellen Guiley.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, she was just tremendous, a very nice person, and just prolific with her books and so forth. So Hans Holzer would definitely be one. The Warrens, I think, because of, all of the activity that they were around, I think the Warrens would have been great folks to interview. And I'd like to find out Thomas Edison. What was he up to with the telephone to the dead? What was the deal with that?
Oh, yes, that's a good pick.
Yeah,
yeah, that would be okay. I'd be like, okay, Tom, how close were you?
Yeah. I would love to hear you do that interview.
Yeah, that would be interesting because that's amazing. And that makes me think of, I think, for example, with him, these deathbed visions. And I think what he said was, when he was dying, was, it's very beautiful over there. And
oh, yeah.
Like Steve Jobs, our own kind of Thomas Edison in terms of business at least, said, oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. So you wonder what they saw. I guess we'll eventually all find out. And that's why I always say in the shows, that's the number one question to me. What happens after we die? Because I think that answers a lot of the other questions. And I think it's truly one of those things that it is universal. It doesn't matter if you are the biggest pop star in the world, the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Prime Minister, the President of the United States, or a ditch digger. We're all going to walk that journey. So it is truly a universal question.
That's very true.
So we've got to ask, with all the stories you've heard and bearing in mind what you do, have you had any paranormal experiences yourself?
Well, the thing is that I've had experiences, I think, but they're subtle. I have more kind of weird coincidences. I have not seen a full body apparition yet. Nothing like that. One of my favorite stories, because I believe sometimes our loved ones can communicate with us in kind of odd ways.
Yeah.
And this happened to me a few years ago. I was asked to speak on a paranormal cruise. And I mentioned Rosemary Ellen Guiley. She was there. This was obviously before she passed, and there were some other folks speaking. And it was my turn to speak, and we were in this little conference room on this ship out in the Caribbean somewhere. And I had a little bit of a cold, pre-pandemic again. So it was a cold. And I said, well, I'm going to go to the little cafe over here and get some coffee before I speak, to kind of warm up my throat. So to do that, you had to walk through the casino on the ship. And there was a gentleman there playing a machine where you have like a joystick and a crane comes down and grabs money.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and then you try to grab the money. Now, I don't know if you guys have those over in the UK, but over here, sometimes in shops and pharmacies
We have
or
something
discount
similar.
stores.
Not very common, but I have seen them.
Yeah, with the little stuffed animals. And you try to get. Well, I had an uncle who was like my second dad. Grew up with him, and he loved those machines. Like he would go into a store and drop $10 on trying to get one stupid little toy. I don't know. It was just for the sport of it. And I had a very intense thought of him. And it's like, oh, I would love him to be here right now. Love for him to be here right now. This would be great because, not only do you have this claw game, it's for money.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't win, but he would have a great time doing this. I wish he were here and had that opportunity. And the reason I noticed, I think, was because one member of our party was playing the machine. I think that's what kind of called it out to me. So anyway, no sooner that I thought that, a woman walks over next to the machine, cups her hand to her mouth, and says, "John, John," like calling out to someone. Guess what my uncle's name was?
Oh, really?
John.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And then this other John came up. It must have been her husband. Now, somebody joked with me and said, "Yeah, what was his name, Steve?" No. But the point being, to me, it was almost like he put those puzzle pieces in place to make all that happen, or somebody did, to show me that I was thinking of him. He recognized that, and he was thinking of me too.
Oh, I think that's just beautiful. I just love stories like that. And I think, it's one of the things I really enjoy about being a paranormal enthusiast is just being open to those kind of experiences. We are quite skeptical in a more practical kind of way. We don't think that absolutely everything is a ghost.
Right.
But I think there's so much joy in being open to that kind of communication that is possibly from beyond. And it just warms my heart. I love those stories.
Yeah, and I've got to say, you said that you haven't seen a full body apparition. You may have done, because there's been plenty of times where we've seen things, and the only reason we've realised that it's not something normal is because of the location.
Or the context.
Or the
Yeah,
context.
that's a good point.
Yeah.
You might have seen hundreds of them walking down the high street and never even noticed.
Yeah, the only reason, the story I shared earlier about the person I saw looking back at me and looking really surprised, looked like a completely actual, real, physical person. The only reason I knew it wasn't was because he was in my room and he shouldn't have been there.
No, that's an excellent point. We could pass ghosts every day and not even know it. That's very true.
Well, we've just got one more question for you, but before we wrap up, I just wanted to thank you, not just for taking the time to speak with us today, although we are very grateful for that, of course, but I wanted to thank you for the content that you create. I've spoken often on this show about how I started listening to ghost story and paranormal podcasts because I was going through quite a difficult time in my life. And Jim Howard's Campfire was actually one of the shows that I found really great comfort in, and it helped me through a difficult time. We've always thought that it's so important to have safe spaces where we can talk about the paranormal without fear of judgment or fear-mongering, and it's one of the reasons we started this show. But you very much laid the groundwork for that in Campfire and in the Paranormal Podcast. So we're really grateful to you for holding that safe space for so many years and continuing to do so. And I think you've touched on this a little bit already, but my last question for you is, what are your hopes for the future of paranormal pop culture? What would you love to see for the worldwide paranormal community going forwards?
Well, what I would like to see is maybe a little more return to kind of looking at things a little more seriously. Not that you can't have fun with things. I think in every endeavor of human participation that we should have fun. And we should be able to make a joke and those kind of things. You're talking about work, home, anything you think, religion, whatever. I think that you should be able to have fun.
Absolutely.
But sometimes I think with the paranormal TV shows that are constantly out there, or currently out there, that it's becoming a little cartoonish.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think there's a place for those shows, and I don't think they should go away. But I also would love to see some pursuit more along the lines of what we see in podcasting, where there's serious discussions about these things. That's what we try to do on the Paranormal Podcast, where we, not that we're going to get any answers. I don't know that we are, but have a more serious discussion. I'd like to see more of that in kind of popular culture, and not just, three guys in black T-shirts with a night cam going, "Ooh, what was that?"
Yeah. Yelling at ghosts in the dark. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know some of those people are on those shows, and there's some very good people on those shows, but we need that plus.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I don't want that to be just the whole diet, and that seems what it is. It's probably because that's what sells, and that's the way the world goes around. But I would like to see more. I would love somebody to do. We talked about bring it for full circle, In Search Of. I'd love somebody to do a major effort for a show like that, more almost like a journalistic, not that it was high journalism, it wasn't, but more of a journalistic kind of approach to these kind of questions. Who knows if it could be successful or not, but I'd love to see something like that.
Well, our listeners will already know that we completely agree with you. And yeah, we feel very much the same way. There's nothing wrong with those shows. They have their place. But like you say, when it's the only thing on the menu, we would just love to. And that's why podcasts like your podcasts are so important, because it provides the balance, and I hope that in the future there's just more of that kind of well-rounded look at the paranormal. So yeah, I absolutely couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much. We're so grateful for you taking the time to come on our show. This has been the most fascinating chat. We could carry on quizzing you for hours, but we won't. We will let you free back into the wild.
Yep. I've just got to say one thing before you go, and that's if there's any TV execs listening, just putting it out there, In Search Of with Jim Harold.
Yeah, In Search Of with Jim Harold. Yes, please. I would watch that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to be with both of you. And as I always say to my callers, to you and your audience, stay spooky.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Knock Once for Yes. If you've not come across Jim Harold before and you enjoyed this interview, you will find links to all of his podcasts, shows, and information in the show notes. Please do go and check out his work.
Thank you so much to Jim Harold for joining us this episode, and thank you for everyone that shared their stories with us. And don't forget that if you've got a paranormal experience that you'd like to share, please do get in touch at knockonceforyes.com.
A huge thank you to our patrons, coffee and Repod supporters, without whom we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And thank you to everyone for listening and interacting with us on social media, through our website and emailing us. We love hearing from you, and we absolutely love the little spooky community that we've built over the years.
Knock Once for Yes is produced by my production company, Narrative Audio. And if you have a podcast and would like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch either through Knock Once for Yes or narrativeaudio.com. We hope that you enjoyed this episode and that you'll join us again for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Knock Once for Yes.